this screencast, we're going to start thinking about the mini essay question that comes at the end of paper 2, higher level. It's always worth 12 marks, and what it does is it gives you a prompt, it gives you a statement, and asks you to what extent you agree with that statement. And what the examiner wants to see is, above all, that you know the set text really well, that you can draw relevant details from the set text. Number 2, that you can construct some kind of argument, so you can marshal the evidence that you found from the text into an argument. And number 3, that you've read more widely, that you know other bits of text outside of the set texts, and some of the views of literary critics, sort of secondary sources, if you like. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Virgil, especially the Aeneid and the Eclogues, and each time we're going to look at a different theme. Okay, we're going to start with the theme of the characters, right? Who are the characters that Virgil gives us, and how are they presented? So that's going to be the first theme. You'll see that this exercise is going to be quite intense in terms of finding quotations from the text, but it'll get easier when we do other themes later, because you'll find that the same quotations keep on coming back again and again, right? You can use the same quotations for different themes. So, we're going to start with Turnus, and I'm going to talk you through it, and then you can make some notes on this. You can look at your text and find some of the quotations that I refer to, if they come from within the set text. And then at the end, I'll put an example of an essay question that they could ask, and you can have a think about that, think about how you might approach it, and then we'll spend the next lesson doing a kind of plan of that essay, or writing a version of that mini essay together. So, as I say, let's start with Turnus. Okay, so one thing that's important about Turnus is that in Book 6 of the Aeneid, Aeneas is talking to a prophetess called the Sibyl, and she warns Aeneas that he's going to have to fight a big war again. Right? He's already fought the Trojan War against Achilles and others. Now he's going to have to fight a second Achilles, and that's a reference to Turnus. So earlier in the poem, Turnus is built up as a second Achilles. However, as the poem comes towards the end, Turnus's role is reversed. Turnus becomes less and less like Achilles, more and more like Hector, who gets defeated, of course. So, for example, in the rock simile that we read in our set text, book 12, lines 6, 8, 4 to 9, you get this simile of Turnus sort of charging in like a rock, and that simile is based on a simile about Hector, not Achilles, but Hector from the Iliad. Similarly, there's the dream simile, also in our set text, book 12, lines 908 to 12. That simile, again, is modelled on one in the Iliad, which is not about Achilles, it's about Hector. I've also put here a sort of general point about Turnus, which comes from a literary critic called Jasper Griffin. He writes that Turnus's irrational violence marks him out, despite his prowess, for defeat. He doesn't think to let his army into the Trojan camp in Book 9. That's a situation where basically Turnus manages to enter the Trojan camp, and if he had opened the gates and let his army in, he would have won the war, but he didn't. He just goes on a rampage and then is forced to retreat. He also abandons an ambush too soon in Book 11, and he also takes the wrong sword for his final duel with Aeneas. That is a moment that we read in our set text together. It's also worth going back and reading the final speech of Turnus. Okay, his final speech, in which he basically asks Aeneas not to kill him. Or he says, if you do have to kill me, at least give my body back to my family. And a critic called R. Heinze writes about this. Turnus had not been able to go calmly to meet his enemy in the final duel, neither can he face death with a steady mind now. His last words express a fervent desire to live, and to gain that end he is even prepared to give up his claim to Lavinia. Right, that might seem a bit harsh, but that's one view. By the way, if there's anything in here you don't understand, do make a note of it so that you can ask in the lesson. On the other hand, you have Richard Tarrant on Turnus's final speech. He's a bit more balanced. He says the speech is fully in character for Turnus, particularly as he has been portrayed in this book, that's book 12. An attempt at heroic nobility is undermined by fear of death. Right, so he's quite noble, but at the same time, not entirely noble because he's so afraid to die. There are moments in the text, in our text that we read together, where Turnus seems quite ineffective, a bit useless. For example, at the very beginning, he is just following a few stragglers, right? He's not defending the city where he should be. He's also described as now slower, and he's also less and less happy in the success of his horses. So he seems a bit rubbish when we first meet him. He also often is a bit confused as to what he should do. So he says in 637, "What should I do now? What am I to do?" There's also a moment where he's running away from Aeneas, where he's weaving these uncertain circles. So he doesn't sound very decisive or clear about what he should do. And there's also a moment in line 919 where Aeneas speaks to him as he hesitates. Right? So Turnus is seen to be hesitating, cunctanti. He also makes some poor judgments or has moments where he lacks understanding. So, for example, he asks what safety or salvation fortune now promises. Right? And this is a bit of a misunderstanding because fortune doesn't promise things. The whole point of fortune is that it's fickle, you don't know what's going to happen. You know, one day it's one thing, the next day it's something else. So he sort of misunderstands what fortune is all about. He also strikes Aeneas thinking it safe, impune putans, but of course it's not safe, so he gets that wrong. And of course the reason he gets it wrong is because he's brought the wrong sword, which is a bit stupid. Also, there are times when he gets very angry. So in 622, or becomes afraid. In 622 he's described as amains, out of his mind. Later he's astonished, obstipuit. Later he's sort of there's this mixture of sort of shame and rage that's boiling inside him. Later we hear about the blazing circles of his eyes. Later he's described as turbidus, he's very sort of agitated. He also asks Juturna to let him sort of vent his fury. And there's also a simile where he is compared to, I think it's a deer, which is being chased by a hunting dog and is very afraid. So he's afraid as well. There's also this moment where his hair stands on end and his voice sort of sticks in his throat. And there's another moment where he is hesitating and he's shuddering with fear at the fact that death is approaching. So yes, he has moments of anger and fear, which is maybe not great. He's also very aware all the time of being judged by other people. So for example, he worries that if he doesn't fight now, he won't be able to rebut the nasty things that Drances said about him. So he's worried about what Drances and the others would think. He's worried about the land of Italy seeing him fleeing. He's worried about his sister seeing him being dishonourable. And also, right towards the end, he looks at his Rutulians and the city. So he's constantly looking at other people and thinking about what they might think about him. On the other hand, a more positive feature is that he's always seen as being somehow natural in the place where he is. He fits. He's not a foreigner. He really belongs to Italy and to the land where he is, right? So he talks, for example, about the whatever it is in line 674, a big siege engine or something or other, a tower, I think it is, which he himself had built. Right, so he in some way contributed to this city. He belongs there, possibly in a way that Aeneas doesn't. He also has this connection to the local god Faunus, who and the earth, who help him out by holding Aeneas's spear. Right, so remember, the Trojans have disrespected the local gods by destroying this sacred tree, whereas Turnus, he knows the local religion and customs and all that kind of thing. He also picks up this huge ancient stone later on, which was used as a boundary marker. So again, he's associated with the history of his place. He's also compared, you remember, to Aeneas's spear is compared to a battering ram, and so by implication, Turnus is compared to a city, basically. So Turnus is kind of linked to the city and the land and so forth. Another positive thing is he can be pretty brave and strong at times. So he tells his sister to stop delaying fate. At one point, he's like a rock kind of falling from a mountain, which sounds pretty powerful and scary. He also says, whatever fate awaits us, it is mine, right? So he is willing to take on the fate of the Italians. He doesn't want that fate to fall on his soldiers, which is good. He tells Aeneas that he's not scared of him. He's only afraid of the gods, really, and his enemy Jupiter. So that's quite good. He also, he doesn't do very well with this stone, but he is able to lift the stone, which apparently even 12 chosen men today, in Augustus's time, would be unable to lift, so he's pretty strong. And Virgil also says in 913, with whatever courage he sought away, he failed. So, in a sense, it's a bad thing because he failed, but Virgil is also saying that he was at least having a go, right? He was acting with courage, even though he was failing. Now, let's come to Aeneas. Okay, now Aeneas, earlier on in the Aeneid, in Book 4, he is called a second Paris, right, by this African prince called Iarbas. He's called a second Paris, with eunuchs in attendance and hair dripping with perfume and so on. So Iarbas basically sees Aeneas as one of these girly, decadent Eastern people, right? Like Paris, like the Trojan Paris. And of course, we might think that this is true about Aeneas. He is like Paris, okay? Because the most famous thing that Paris does is he abducts another man's wife. He abducts Helen, the wife of Menelaus. And that seems quite similar to Aeneas, right? Because Aeneas is coming from the east and taking Lavinia, who is engaged to Turnus. So in a way, this seems fair, right? It seems like Aeneas is a second Paris. However, as we've already seen, in Book 12, Aeneas starts to seem less like Paris and much more like Achilles. So again, it's worth thinking about those parallels to Homer. In general, in the Aeneid, Aeneas is someone who carries burdens, okay? So in Book 8, he looks at the shield which the god Vulcan has made for him, which is covered in pictures of future Roman history. And we're told that Aeneas lifts on his shoulders the fame and fate of his descendants. So that's a great image for him being someone who carries a huge burden, a huge responsibility. He can also be extremely kind. For example, in Book 5, all of these Trojan women burn the ships because they want to stay in Sicily. And that's very bad, because it stops them, it's supposed to stop them getting to Italy. But Aeneas actually is very nice about it, right? He doesn't punish them or anything for burning his ships. He just comforts them with words of love and weeps as he entrusts them to Acestes, who will rule this Trojan community in Sicily. So again, he's a very nice leader at times. He's also definitely someone who suffers a lot, right? His first words in the Aeneid are a wish that he had died at Troy. He has to leave Troy, of course, because it's destroyed. He has to leave his wife Creusa, who dies. He has to leave Dido, who he falls in love with in Carthage, and she kills herself. He has to leave these Trojans in Sicily. His dad, Anchises, dies as well. His friend Pallas dies. He has to marry this other woman, Lavinia, who probably he doesn't love her, and she probably doesn't love him, as far as we know. And also, we're told that he's only going to live for 3 years at the end of the poem anyway. He also, in Book 12, this is before our set text, he says in this rather sad phrase to his son Ascanius, he says, "From me, my son, you can learn courage and hard toil. Others will teach you about fortune." In other words, Aeneas thinks that he is courageous and he's a hard worker, but he's not lucky. His life has been one of misfortune. The big question about Aeneas in Book 12 is whether or not he's right to kill Turnus. In one sense, it seems no, right? Aeneas' father told him in Book 6 that he should pardon the defeated, and in Book 12 he seems to do the opposite of that. And of course, there's a big contrast with the Iliad, right? The Iliad, yes, Achilles kills Hector, but at least afterwards, he does give back Hector's body for burial. He and Hector's father, Priam, have a kind of reconciliation, sort of. Whereas in the Aeneid, it's just, that's the end, right? Aeneas kills Turnus, and the poem stops. On the other hand, Evander, Pallas's father, did ask Aeneas to avenge his son. So in that way, Aeneas is just doing that for Evander. And also, we do have to wonder, would Augustus see this kind of revenge as a bad thing? And maybe not, right? Because Augustus actually was very keen on revenge. In fact, he built a temple to the god Mars, calling him Mars Ultor, which means Mars the Avenger, right? A big part of Augustus's image was that he was avenging the death of Julius Caesar. He was punishing the people who killed Julius Caesar. So maybe in Augustan thinking, this act of revenge would not be so bad. In our text, in our set text, it's important to remember that Aeneas is associated with the mighty god Jupiter, right? He thunders in arms. He's also a father figure, in the same way that Jupiter is the father of men and gods. And also, he makes a noise even louder than a thunderbolt, right? So in all sorts of ways, he is associated with Jupiter, so that's probably a good thing. He's also very decisive and effective, possibly unlike Turnus. So he throws off all delays and breaks off everything that he's doing. He follows foot by foot, he presses on the track and so on in line 748. He also asks Turnus later, what delay is there now? Why are you trying to delay still? So he's very decisive and so on. He's also very brave, which is like Turnus, but maybe more so, right? At one point, he's like Athos or Eryx, or he's making a noise like a mighty mountain. Also notice the last mountain he's compared to is Father Apennine, which is in Italy. So Virgil is trying to suggest that Aeneas is not entirely a foreigner. In some ways, he is linked to local geography. And also, coming back to that simile where Aeneas is a hunting dog and Turnus is a frightened deer. So again, he is pretty intimidating. He also, though, can come across as quite savage and or dangerous. So, for example, at one point, he's threatening not just to defeat the Italians, but to destroy the city, exciserunt urbem, which is pretty nasty. He's also described as speaking from a savage breast. Right? Savage is not often a positive thing. He's also fired up with fury and terrible in anger, which again is not that great. And of course, he sees the death of Turnus as a human sacrifice, which we could say is a very bad thing, because the Romans generally disapproved of human sacrifice. Or you could argue the opposite. You could say, well, Achilles did it in the Iliad, and also Augustus may well have done it, as we saw last time. Okay, so that's Aeneas. The next character that we have is Juturna. What about her? Well, she breaks the treaty. Okay, she gets one of the Italians to shoot Aeneas, which breaks the peace treaty. So that seems a bit sneaky. She also encourages Turnus to abandon the city and let people defend their own houses, which again seems a little bit selfish. She's also described as a bold nymph, although possibly that's Juno's opinion, but she's described as a bold nymph, and she does seem pretty bold. But of course, the reason for her boldness, you could say, it's a good reason, right? It's love for her brother. She also I think she comes across as very sympathetic later because, she's very bitter about being immortal. She'd rather die. She'd rather go down to the shades as a companion for her wretched brother. So I think that's quite a sympathetic portrayal. Then we have the royal family of Laurentum. We have King Latinus, Queen Amata, and their daughter Lavinia. Latinus is described by the literary critic Jasper Griffin as an elderly and ineffective ruler who looks on unhappily as younger and more violent men do the fighting. Okay, and in our text, he's a pretty uncertain onlooker. He's not very involved. At one point, he mutters about who he should call his sons-in-law. Should he pick Aeneas or should he pick Turnus? At another moment, he's amazed about these two men, Aeneas and Turnus, who have come from opposite ends of the world and are now fighting it out. So he doesn't do very much, basically. His queen, on the other hand, does something pretty striking, which is she hangs herself in despair at the thought of Aeneas marrying her daughter, and we hear about that in lines 659 to 60. She was very much trusting in Turnus, and in terror she fled the light. As for Lavinia, we find out very little about her in the Aeneid, although we do get a little hint, early in Book 12, before our set text, that actually maybe Lavinia would prefer Turnus. And the hint is this. Just after Amata has begged Turnus not to fight the Trojans, Virgil says, when Lavinia heard these words of her mother, her burning cheeks were bathed in tears, and the deep flush glowed and spread over her face. So some critics have interpreted her blushing to signify that she would prefer Turnus. But again, that's certainly not totally clear. It's not unambiguous. Okay, Jupiter is another character we get. He is associated with Aeneas and Rome, as we've already seen. We also get a sense that Jupiter doesn't have control over fate, right? Because at one point he has to get his weighing scale out and see who is going to win. So that might suggest he doesn't actually control fate. However, he is very powerful and sort of majestic, right? He says to Juno, right, it's come to the end. I forbid you, that's this one, I forbid you to try any further. He's also described as the creator of men and gods, so he's very mighty and powerful and impressive. He's also quite a cunning rhetorician, or he's quite a cunning speaker as well, because when he speaks to Juno, he's getting what he wants, but he pretends that he's sort of compromising, right? So he says, I, having been conquered and willing, I hand myself over to you. So he's pretending that Juno's won. He also kind of flatters Juno by saying that no race will celebrate her rituals as much as the future Romans. So he's quite a good politician, if you like. He's also pretty scary, right? Because we hear about the Dirai, the dread ones, which attend on his throne. He's described as the savage king, Saevi Regis, when he wants to wreak destruction upon mortals. So he's very scary as well. And he also has, as well as being the mighty god of everything, the king of the gods and so forth, there is also a little occasional link between Jupiter and sexual assault of women, because in our text there is a mention of the fact that he raped Juturna, which is why she is immortal. That was her consolation prize. And there's also a mention in Book 4 of this man Iarbas, and Virgil says Jupiter had ravished a Garamantian nymph, an African nymph, and Iarbas was his son. Right? So again, there's a little hint of Jupiter's kind of rather embarrassing love life. Although not as much as in Ovid and so on, because we're still in a serious epic here. Okay, now, Juno. Okay, Juno, her main role in the Aeneid is to be the main enemy of the Trojans. And famously, at the beginning of Book 1, the narrator says, "Why did she," that's Juno, "drive a man famous for his piety," that's Aeneas, "to such endless hardship and such sufferings? Can there be so much anger in the hearts of the heavenly gods?" Well, it seems like the answer is yes. One thing in our text is that she's very angry. So Jupiter says, "Put away your fury, your frenzy, furorem." Jupiter also says, "Ah, yes, you're clearly a real daughter of Saturn and my real sister, because you turn over such great floods of anger beneath your breast." So she's very angry. She's also very scary. Right? She says, "If I didn't know that it was fated for Turnus to lose, you would see me, encircled with flame on the battlefield." Right? So she's a pretty scary goddess. She's also in a bit of a sulk when we meet her, right? Jupiter says, "Why are you clinging here in these icy clouds?" This kind of thing. She's also a bit sneaky and untrustworthy, right? She swears by the implacable head of the Stygian spring, but of course the thing that she's swearing is sneaky because it's not really the thing she's been accused of. She's also kind of fickle as well, because of course she is the one who has whipped Turnus up to fight, and then as soon as Jupiter offers her something nice, she's happy and just forgets all about it. So she really stitches Turnus up, if you like. She sort of betrays him, you could say. There's also, if you remember, take this out actually, if you remember, we talked about how she, in the meantime, leaves heaven, and that's possibly a hint that she will resume her enmity towards Rome in the Punic Wars later, the wars between Rome and Carthage, where Juno will support Carthage. Alright, moving on quickly to the eclogues, we have Tityrus. What's he like? Well, in general, he's quite an insensitive character. Right, he keeps on ignoring Meliboeus' questions and just talking about what he wants to talk about. So when Meliboeus says, why did you go to Rome? What were you trying to do there? He just starts going on and on about the city. And similarly, later, he just goes on and on and on about, "I will never forget Octavian. You'd find deer grazing in the sky before I forget about Octavian," all this sort of stuff. So he's quite insensitive. He's obsessed with his own good fortune and doesn't really think about Meliboeus' situation, nor does he really answer Meliboeus' questions. This bit that I've highlighted here is perhaps particularly insensitive because he's talking about, Germans drinking from a river in the Far East and so on, and how unlikely that is. But of course, this sort of thing is exactly what's happening to Meliboeus, right? Meliboeus is having to leave his home and go somewhere else. So Tityrus is referencing and saying that it's very unlikely, exactly the sort of thing that is happening to Meliboeus. But you could say at the end, he's quite nice, right? At the end, he offers hospitality to Meliboeus, right? He says, "Oh, you can spend the night with me. The shadows are growing longer and, night is falling," and all this kind of stuff. On the other hand, you have Meliboeus here, okay, he seems a pretty nice guy, he's quite selfless, he doesn't want to just wallow in self-pity, he says to Tityrus, "Tell me more about this god of yours," rather than just saying, "Oh, shut up, Tityrus, go away." And also, yes, he gets a bit angry at one point. He's very angry about the idea of some impious soldier having his fields, and the idea of barbarians, on his land. But, he's not angry with Tityrus. He's only angry at the general situation, right? The confiscation of his land. Okay, so that's a very quick run-through of how the characters are presented in our texts. So you might want to go and have a look back at some of those references that I've given you, and then start to think about this question. So I've phrased this just like you would see it in an IB exam. To what extent do you agree with the following prompt? Your answer should demonstrate your understanding of the prescribed author, that's Virgil, knowledge of broader contexts, right, that's sort of literary context like Homer, or historical context like the land confiscations, or like, you know, I don't know, the murder of Julius Caesar or whatever it is, and critical analysis. Right? In other words, you know, you need to be doing some analysis and be aware of what other scholars have said in their analysis. And here is a prompt that I've made up. In Virgil's poetry, the losers are always more sympathetic than the winners. Okay, so in the light of what I've said in the screencast, and in the light of your reading over the last few months of Aeneid 12 and the two eclogues, have a think about that question, and then in our first lesson next week, on Monday, we will have a go at planning and writing that essay together.